So the thing I keep thinking about is, was it worth it to be happy for a little bit?
The breaking point for me was COVID. After COVID happened, I saw my church's initial reaction, and instead of wondering how we could save lives and how we could protect people from the virus, the first reaction was essentially frustration and anger at the fact that people couldn't meet for worship. It was very self serving, and that tone never changed. The frustration and complaints were not about the virus itself, but about the things that people had to do to protect other people. Things such as wearing masks, getting tested for COVID, socially isolating, and eventually vaccination. And that was so frustrating to me. Why is it that our first instinct as Christians wasn't to help other people? And that started a chain of events where essentially I realized that there were so many more moments that happened prior to this that I should have recognized and I should have left a long time ago. Now, this was in a Presbyterian church, but I've also been to a non denominational, a Southern Baptist, and two Chinese Baptist churches. And essentially, there was a wide variety of responses to COVID by the Christian church, most notably like Kenneth Copeland trying to blow away the disease during worship, which was incredibly in poor taste and wrong, of course. But when I saw this wide variety of responses, and then I realized that if you were to try to see if a believer was different than a non believer, when it came to responding to COVID, I don't think you would see much of a difference or much of an improvement, if you will. And that made me wonder, not only are people not really being influenced by Christianity more so than their media and politics, but also, is Christianity making me into a better person? Like, am I improving? Am I reaching my full potential? Am I becoming a better person by being in this religion? And seeing my peers around me like repeat talking points of Dan Patrick saying that we need to reopen the economy or that we should put, profit over people left really bad taste in my mouth, and I realized that I didn't want to be part of this. I have noticed this for a very long time, that when the church is faced between choosing the truth and its authority, it will choose its authority. Like, they still deny evolution. They continually deny evolution as being real science for the past 2 centuries because, well, they think it impedes on their authority. And they're wrong. Like, they have been disproven over and over again, yet they continue to cling on to that belief. And there are moments where it's on a more interpersonal level. I know people who have been SA'd in the church, and they decided not to do anything about it because, well, that might harm their numbers. And that's, again, not the type of person I want to be. So I'm thinking about the type of person I'm becoming in the church, and I realize that there's not only a lot of ignorance, not only a lot of anxiety, but there's a lot of repression and suppression. And there was anxiety because I was constantly wondering whether I was going to hell or not, which is just not an acceptable way to function. I knew this one guy. I still know him actually. He posts on Facebook like 10 times a day about how good God is. And he apologizes to random people who do not have any grievances towards him because he has massive crippling anxiety about the fact that he might be going to hell if he's not good enough. There's also this fear among men in the church that they need to justify their existence when your existence is its own justification. And they have this idea that if they don't prove themselves as men, then they're worthless. There's a great deal of ignorance as well. It was very frustrating. There was a lot of mischaracterization in the church. People would get together and pat themselves on the back about how they're much smarter than what the other people believe and they have all the answers. And this fomented into incuriosity, which I cannot stand. I really dislike the idea that we do not need to learn anything more because we already have the answers to what we need to know. And I was told this like so many times throughout the church. I would ask questions like, well, what if we're wrong about this? And they would say, well, Andrew, you don't need to know or understand everything. Sometimes you can just see it as it is. And I would say, well, I'm not trying to understand everything. I just want to understand more, which I think is acceptable. Like, if God allows us to pursue truth, why are we not pursuing it? And they didn't like to hear it. Usually they would say things like, well, it's a fallen world, or there are limits to human intelligence, which I didn't care for either. Not only is there a great deal of anxiety in the church, but there is a lot of suppression and repression. For instance, they have like no gossip rules, which means that people can't talk to each other about things that are very pertinent. For instance, if someone gets violated in the church, if someone gets cheated in the church, if people need help with health or that sort of thing. And there's other things as well, such as the fact that like love, care, and affection becomes scarce in the church. And they don't want you to experience that outside of the church because they might have less control over you. So they start saying that things are of the devil. Oh, university is of the devil. Oh, concerts are of the devil. Oh, this type of music is of the devil. And I noticed that too, where I was raised with this mindset that people being kind to each other is rare. When, if you actually understand anthropology and who we are as human beings, it's common. Violence is rare, but it's taught to us to believe that violence is the default nature of man, which I disagree with fundamentally. Now, while contemplating this mentality for several months, I started to look towards the people in my church that were either in leadership positions or pursuing God the most intently. And I just wasn't very impressed. Like, I just did not want to be like these people. For starters, there was a lot of arrogance. There were a lot of people who, because they had the answer to everything, did not see the value in pursuing the questions. For instance, I was in Sunday school. I was 5 years old, and my grandma had just come back from Taiwan, and she gave me a pair of shoes I was very happy to have. And I remember telling my Sunday school teacher, like, look, these shoes came from Taiwan. It meant so much to me. And her response was just, it doesn't matter where they came from. Like, that was her first response. And she's, watching over several children. But there were a lot of people with very narrow views as to what the world was supposed to be like, what gender roles were supposed to be like. And a lot of those views came from 1940s or 50s America, not from the Bible. There was also a great deal of people who did not really know how to maintain proper boundaries. And I noticed that because Christian culture doesn't really help you learn how to exhibit proper boundaries. It's very easy to sin as much as you want, then claim repentance and receive forgiveness without doing any of the work. I've seen that again and again throughout the church's history. I think fundamentally incuriosity was the main turnoff for me. Like, for instance, there would be so many people in the church who hate all these groups of people that they know nothing about. I knew a guy in seminary, and he would complain about drag queens, calling them predators or whatnot, like so many times. And so finally I was like, well, have you met any drag queens before? Have you actually had a conversation with them? Would you like me to introduce you to one? And they said, no, I never have actually. They don't understand what they're hating. They just continue to hate something because it's different or against what they believe. And that's not the type of person I want to be. What if I'm trying to share the gospel with these people? If these people need the gospel, then why am I looking down on them? That's not what a servant's supposed to do. There is also a lot of misogyny and racism within the church, the latter of which is largely a great deal of implicit bias, especially in the South. I'm not familiar with churches in other states, so it might be different in the North or in the West. But essentially, the church is a major proponent of things like the Madonna whore complex. And that sort of repression that they have towards affection and love and any type of like physical contact and in purity culture essentially kind of fuels that, where you have a lot of young men in the church who are trying to get all of their physical, emotional, and sexual needs met by one person, which will ultimately fail them. And you have a lot of men who are getting married only for the sake of being able to lose their virginity, which is a terrible idea. And then you have a lot of women who are discouraged from pursuing careers. You have a lot of women who are discouraged from speaking up, and you have a lot of women who aren't taken as seriously as men are in the church as well. There is a great deal of racism in the church. However, it's very implicit and it's not very overt. And a lot of people in the church purely see racism as being interpersonal and straightforward, which it rarely is. But I saw a lot of pointed moments directed at my mother, and I also saw a great deal of racism towards people from the Middle East. For example, my brother grew a beard, he still has it, and the first response to it from one of our elders was that he looked like a terrorist. And I would never tolerate that sort of treatment towards someone I care about if I ever heard that today. I haven't been back to church in 3 years. I don't really have any intention of going back, and I'm not really interested in trying any other religions. Right now, I'm mainly just focused on doing what I can to help other people, and ultimately, I don't think that I was going to be a better or fully realized person if I were to stay in the church. I think that I would be more repressed, more frustrated, and just a lesser version of myself. So that's why I don't go anymore.